High in a restricted stretch of western Tibet, a group of Chinese monks broke a silence they had kept for most of their lives, and what they revealed about Mount Kailash has left researchers, monks, and even government officials struggling to explain what is actually happening on that mountain. This is not a story about religion alone. This is a story about a mountain that modern instruments cannot fully measure, that ancient texts describe as something built rather than grown, and that a small circle of monastery elders now says was never meant to stay secret forever. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand why so many people who study Kailash walk away convinced that something is happening there that science has not caught up to yet. Mount Kailash rises 6,638 meters above sea level in the remote Nari prefecture of the Tibet Autonomous Region, under direct Chinese administration. It is not the tallest peak in the region. Dozens of Himalayan summits stand higher, and many of them have already been climbed and mapped in detail. But Kailash has never been climbed, not once not by any expedition in recorded history, and this is not because nobody has tried. Several teams over the decades have requested permission, and in the rare cases, climbers turned back before reaching the summit, often citing reasons that had nothing to do with weather or terrain. The Chinese government itself maintains an unofficial but consistently enforced restriction on summit attempts, and local monastic authorities have long asked visitors to only walk around the mountain rather than climb it. What makes Kailash strange before you even consider the religious dimension is its shape. Natural mountains are irregular. They are carved slowly by glaciers, cracked by tectonic pressure, and worn down unevenly by wind and rain across millions of years. Kailash does not look like that. Its four faces align with remarkable precision to the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, and its slopes on each side are strikingly symmetrical. Geologists who have studied the formation describe it as an unusually clean pyramidal structure for a peak shaped entirely by natural forces. From a distance, many visitors describe the same reaction, that it looks less like something that grew out of the earth and more like something that was constructed and then covered by time. Four of the world's major spiritual traditions consider this mountain sacred, and they arrived at that belief independently in different centuries, speaking different languages, with no contact with each other. Tibetan Buddhists call it Kang Rinpoche, the precious jewel of snow, and regard it as the dwelling place of the Buddha Demchok, a deity associated with supreme bliss. Hindus consider it the eternal home of Lord Shiva, and ancient Hindu texts describe it as the axis of the world, the fixed point around which Parvat, and believe it is the place where Rishabhadeva, the first Tirthankara, achieved liberation. The ancient Bon religion, which predates Buddhism in Tibet by thousands of years, considers Kailash the single most powerful spiritual location on the planet. Four unrelated belief systems, separated by geography and time, all pointed to the exact same mountain as the center of the sacred world. That kind of convergence does not happen by accident, and it is the first reason researchers have started paying closer attention to Kailash again. For centuries, monasteries surrounding the mountain have preserved handwritten records that are not prayers or ceremonial instructions. They are closer to field notes, observations, written down by monks who lived near Kailash for generations and recorded what they witnessed happening to pilgrims, to the land, and to their own bodies when they spent time close to the peak. According to several monks who recently agreed to discuss these records publicly for the first time, the texts describe Kailash using a specific term that translates roughly to an anchor point, a location where the normal experience of time becomes unstable. The monks who wrote these accounts were not poets exaggerating for effect. They were disciplined observers whose entire vocation was quiet, careful record-keeping, and what they wrote about time near Kailash is strikingly consistent across documents separated by hundreds of years. The texts describe pilgrims who completed close approaches to the mountain and returned, showing physical changes that did not match the amount of time they had actually been away. Hair and nail growth consistent with several weeks passing when only a few days had elapsed, wounds that healed at a pace far faster than ordinary biology allows. In other recorded cases, the opposite effect appeared, pilgrims describing days that felt like only hours had passed. The monks defined a rough boundary they called the threshold zone, roughly 15 kilometers from the peak, where these effects reportedly begin. Inside that zone, according to the records, the relationship between a person's internal sense of time and the actual passage of time becomes unreliable. This is where modern physics becomes genuinely relevant rather than just decorative. Einstein's general theory of relativity establishes that time is not a fixed constant, and that gravity itself bends the fabric of space-time. In near sufficiently massive objects, time passes measurably slower than it does diurnally, and open space. And this is not speculation. It is something engineers have to account for directly. GPS satellites orbiting Earth run on clocks that must be corrected constantly because time genuinely moves at a different rate in orbit compared to the surface. The question researchers now ask is whether Kailash has some unusual geological or energetic property that creates a localized distortion in the space-time immediately surrounding it. The monks were never trained in relativity and never used its language, yet their centuries-old descriptions line up with what physics tells us is theoretically possible. The modern accounts add a layer that is harder to dismiss because they come from people trained to be skeptical. Scientific expeditions that have visited the region, including groups with Russian research affiliations, documented pilgrims completely along the 52-kilometer circuit around the mountain known as the Kora, and reporting nail and hair growth consistent with weeks of biological activity condensed into roughly 3 days of walking. This is not a supernatural claim on its face. Keratin production is a measurable biological process governed by cellular metabolism, and for that rate to shift so dramatically, something in the immediate environment, whether temperature, pressure, electromagnetic conditions, or something not yet identified, would have to be different near Kailash than anywhere else at similar altitude. The opposite effect has also been documented repeatedly. Experienced mountaineers who attempted approaches toward the northern face, the most direct route toward the summit, described an exhaustion that went far beyond normal physical fatigue, describing it as a cellular tiredness, as though a single day of effort had drained them the way an entire week normally would. Specialists in high-altitude physiology point out that altitude alone does not fully explain this, since Kailash sits at a height that climbers regularly operate at, on other peaks without these specific effects. What stands out most is that these reported effects appear directional, growing stronger the closer someone gets to the mountain and fading the farther away they travel, which is the exact behavior you would expect from a field radiating outward from a central source rather than from random chance or altitude sickness alone. The mental effects reported around Kailash are, in some ways, even harder to explain away than the physical ones. Monks who study these accounts describe a phenomenon they call the return signal. It does not describe D as an external force pushing anyone backward. Instead, people report a sudden and complete internal certainty that they must turn around, arriving all at once with no buildup. What makes this pattern genuinely strange is not that individuals feel anxious in a remote high-altitude environment, which is common enough on its own. What is strange is that entire teams, composed of experienced climbers who had already summited peaks like Everest and K2, have independently reported that every single member of the group felt this compulsion at the same moment with the same intensity, without any one person's fear spreading to the others first. In 2001, a team of experienced Spanish mountaineers received a rare special permit from Chinese authorities to attempt a Kailash summit approach, permission that has almost never been granted before or since. These were elite, veteran climbers with decades of combined experience on some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. They turned back well before reaching the upper slopes, and not because of weather or technical obstacle in their path. They described something closer to a psychological wall, a decision that seemed to arrive in all of them, simultaneously without discussion, as though it had been made for them rather than by them. When interviewed afterward, several members struggled to put the experience into words, with one describing it as a sudden certainty that continuing simply was not something that was going to happen. Not a matter of not wanting to, but something deeper than wanting that had already decided the outcome. The monks describe this not as mountain attacking anyone, but as the mountain communicating, framing the return. Signal as a form of information rather than a threat, one that has apparently remained consistent for as long as human beings have approached the mountain. Equipment failure around Kailash is one of the more objectively documented aspects of this mystery because it has been recorded by multiple independent expeditions using calibrated scientific instruments rather than personal testimony alone. Compasses behave erratically as teams approach the mountain, with needles spinning, fluctuating wildly, or simply failing to settle, a pattern documented across expeditions spanning several different decades. In some reported cases, compasses from entirely different manufacturers failed at the same distance from the peak during the same expedition. Compass disruption is typically explained by localized magnetic anomalies, and geologists have in fact noted unusual magnetic readings in the Kailash region, likely tied to the area's distinct crystalline rock formations and mineral composition compared to the surrounding Himalayan terrain. But the anomalies extend beyond compasses. Pilots flying over the region have reported altimeter and heading system irregularities coming from separate pilots flying different aircraft in different years with no contact with one another. Restricted airspace over the Kailash region is officially attributed to terrain and altitude concerns, yet pilots operating near the edges of that restricted zone have described instrument behavior that other similarly tall peaks in the area do not produce. More recently, drone operators attempting capture aerial footage of Kailash have reported unexpected signal loss and equipment failure at distances that should not normally cause problems, and several drones sent toward the peak have simply never been recovered. The monks say this pattern was expected, describing an old belief that the mountain resists artificial extensions of human senses, cameras, compasses, instruments, technology built to measure or map something the mountain does not permit to be measured or mapped on human terms. The geometry of Kailash becomes even more remarkable once you zoom out to a global scale. Researchers who study the positioning of ancient sacred sites have pointed out that Kailash sits along lines that connect with unusual precision to some of the most studied ancient monuments on Earth, including the Great Pyramid of Giza, Stonehenge, Easter Island, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and Petra in Jordan. Each of these sites was independently built by ancient civilizations with construction precision that still puzzles modern engineers. Each was aligned to specific astronomical events with striking accuracy, and each was identified by its builders as among the most sacred places in their world. When their global positions are mapped together, they connect in ways that researchers say are statistically unlikely to be pure coincidence. Scholars are careful to note that alignment alone cannot prove intentional design, since separated ancient civilizations could plausibly have identified locations of unusual natural energy independently of one another. But the underlying question remains genuinely unresolved, whether ancient peoples possessed knowledge about the Earth's geography and energy systems that has since been lost, and whether Kailash sat at the very center of that lost knowledge. The monks who have chosen to speak believe the answer is yes, describing Kailash as a control point, not in a mechanical sense, but as a central node where multiple systems of the Earth are said to converge and, in a way the ancient texts never fully explain, remain regulated. One fact about Kailash requires no ancient text and no disputed testimony at all, because it is simply geography, and it happens to be extraordinary on its own. 4 of Asia's largest rivers originate from the region immediately surrounding the mountain. The Indus River flows through Tibet, India, and Pakistan, supplying water to hundreds of millions of people. The Sutlej River is a major tributary running through northern India. The Brahmaputra is one of the largest rivers on Earth by water volume, flowing through Tibet, India, and Bangladesh. The Karnali River is a significant tributary of the Ganges, flowing through Nepal. 4 enormous river systems, all beginning within the same small stretch of the Tibetan plateau surrounding Kailash, flowing outward in 4 separate directions that mirror the mountain's own 4 aligned faces. Combined, these rivers sustain freshwater access for an estimated 2 billion people. Ancient Hindu cosmology describes Mount Meru, a cosmic mountain positioned at the exact center of the universe, as the origin point of 4 rivers flowing outward in 4 directions. And modern geography shows that Kailash matches that ancient description with an accuracy that is difficult to write off as coincidence. The most closely guarded claim in these monastic records, the one the monks reportedly held back the longest before final Hawaii agreeing to discuss it, concerns something described as existing beneath the mountain itself. Not treasure, not gold, not artifacts in the conventional sense, but something the texts refer to as a hall of records, a chamber said to contain encoded information about human history that predates the earliest civilizations currently recognized by mainstream archaeology. According to the monks, the same records describe information related to future events framed not as religious prophecy, but as documented turning points, moments in human history that were reportedly anticipated and recorded in advance. There is also a final detail that Iber 18. Monks themselves admit they do not fully understand, something described across multiple texts as intended for a future stage of humanity, sealed until a specific condition is met, a condition the texts never spell out clearly. The monks summarize it simply, saying the mountain will open when humanity is ready, and that the mountain itself, not any person or institution, will determine when that moment arrives. Step back now and look at the complete picture together. A mountain with 4 nearly perfectly aligned faces, positioned at the source of 4 rivers that sustain roughly 2 billion people, geometrically connected to some of the most mysterious ancient structures ever built, considered sacred independently by 4 of the world's major religious traditions, associated with documented disruptions to compasses, aircraft instruments, and drones tied to consistent physical and psychological effects reported across centuries by people who never had contact with one another, and described in monastic records kept quiet for our generations, as an anchor point where time itself does not behave the way it does anywhere else. Any single one of these details could be explained away individually. Together, pointing at the exact same mountain, documented across thousands of years by unconnected observers describing remarkably consistent experiences, they form a different kind of question entirely. One that the monks who finally chose to speak say they are not demanding anyone believe, only that the world is finally asking, and the mountain is still there, unclimbed and still watching. What makes this recent disclosure different from the countless documentaries and blog posts already circulating about Kailash is who is actually speaking. The monks involved are not fringe figures seeking attention. They belong to established monasteries that have operated in the shadow of the mountain for generations, institutions that answer to religious authorities, and, in the current political context, operate under the awareness of Chinese regional administrators. Several of these monks reportedly kept personal vows of silence lasting decades, speaking only within their own monastic wall, less and only to a small circle of senior teachers. For men who spent most of their adult lives in deliberate quiet, to suddenly choose to speak publicly suggests, at the very least, that they believe something about the current moment has changed enough to justify breaking that silence. According to those familiar with the monastic archives, part of what shifted was a growing awareness that outside interest in Kailash had already reached a point where silence no longer served its original purpose. Pilgrims, researchers, and drone operators had already been documenting strange phenomena around the mountain for years, often without any context from the people who had studied it longest. The monks reportedly concluded that withholding their own records no longer protected the mountain from curiosity, since the curiosity had already arrived, and sharing their observations became a way of guiding that attention rather than ignoring it. The Chinese government's own relationship with Kailash adds another layer rarely discussed outside specialist circles. Access to the region has historically been tightly controlled, with permits required for foreign visitors and further restrictions for anyone hoping to approach the base of the mountain rather than simply completing the outer pilgrimage circuit. Researchers who track this pattern note it extends well beyond what would normally be expected for a remote site, especially compared to other Tibetan peaks of similar elevation. Whether this reflects political caution in a sensitive border region, environmental protection, or something closer, to what the monks describe remains genuinely open, and Chinese officials have never directly addressed it in public statements. There's also a scientific angle worth more attention, because it does not require accepting the more extraordinary claims at face value. The Kailash region sits near a boundary where the Indian tectonic plate continues pushing beneath the Eurasian plate, the same collision that created the Himalayas and remains active today. Some geophysicists propose that piezoelectric effects, electrical charges generated by stress on certain crystalline rock formations under pressure, could theoretically produce localized electromagnetic disturbances strong enough to affect compasses and aircraft systems. This kind of effect has been studied in other tectonically active regions, though never confirmed at the scale needed to explain everything reported around Kailash, offering a bridge between the ancient accounts and a mechanism that is at least theoretically plausible. The biological reports deserve a similarly careful second look, because researchers who study high-altitude environments point out that extreme conditions can genuinely alter hormone regulation, circulation, and cellular repair in ways still not fully mapped by modern medicine. Reduced oxygen, intense ultraviolet exposure, and sharp temperature, swings between day and night all place unusual stress on the human body. Whether these known factors alone explain the specific pattern of accelerated healing, altered hair and nail growth, and profound fatigue reported specifically around Kailash, rather than at other peaks of similar elevation, is precisely what keeps researchers returning to this mountain, rather than dismissing the reports outright. Local oral history adds another dimension rarely covered internationally. Communities in the wider Ngari region carry generations-old traditions describing the mountain as alive in some sense, not like an animal, but as a constantly active system rather than a static rock formation. Elders in nearby villages pass down specific warnings about which seasons and approaches are considered safe for the outer pilgrimage circuit, warnings that predate any modern scientific study of the region by centuries, existing purely as spoken knowledge until now. Taken together, none of this proves anything in the way a laboratory experiment proves a hypothesis. What it does is something arguably more interesting, which is establish a genuinely unusual convergence of independent lines of evidence. Religious, geological, biological, historical, and now, newly disclosed monastic testimony, all pointing toward the same conclusion, that Mount Kailash is not simply another Himalayan peak that happens to have religious significance attached to it after the fact. Something about this specific location, whether it is ultimately explained by advanced but still undiscovered geophysics, by psychological and cultural conditioning built up over millennia of belief, or by something closer to what the monks themselves describe, continues to produce effects that people from wildly different backgrounds, eras, and belief systems keep independently reporting in strikingly similar terms. If this video made you think twice about what we actually know versus what we assume we know, subscribe to the channel, because every week we go deeper into the places, discoveries, and unanswered questions that mainstream science has not fully caught up to yet. And the next one may change how you see the world even more than this one did.